Walter, thank you to the staff of the Humanities Center. This was a sort of last-minute imposition, actually, and Walter was so kind to allow me to provide this PowerPoint that I've actually been giving at a number of campuses around Michigan as a way of inserting my way into the discussion of of the third parties and in general. I know probably a lot of people are just burned out by this long election frenzy, and that may be one of the reasons why people, at the last minute decided this is too much to even contend with, and they may be still obsessed with what will happen tomorrow. As historians, one of the great things we get to do is not worry about tomorrow as much as we have to worry about understanding how the past informs our sense of what happens today and tomorrow. So I'm gonna take a look at three particular left-wing campaigns, presidential campaigns, and the way I want to approach this, the kind of schema I'm going to use is to talk first about each of the candidates, give a kind of brief biographical sketch of those particular candidates that will connect with the larger historical context. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of that political party and specifically what was occurring at the time to inform the left program of that political party. And finally, I want to talk about the historical moment and of each of those three candidates, their political party, and the particular historical election, both in terms of what transpired at the time and what its implications were for the future of not only that party, but for the future of issues that have been raised over time. So before I get to that little schema, I want to talk about essentially the impact of third parties. Again, I think this is important to try to highlight why it is that third parties remain significant in informing our political culture. And let me just quote from William O. Douglas, who was one of the Supreme Court justices, in writing a decision: all political ideas cannot and should not be channeled into the program of the two major parties. History has amply proved the virtue of political activity by minority dissident groups, which innumerable times have been in the vanguard of democratic thought and whose programs were ultimately accepted. And I think that's an important framing for understanding why third parties cannot be dismissed, even if their results are rather, at the time of an election, are rather minuscule. To go back even to the 19th century, 1840, there's an interesting article by Dan Labat's in New Politics, if you get a chance to read this. 1840, a very small party called the Liberty Party was the only party that promoted the idea of anti-slavery. The two dominant parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, were wedded to the slaveocracy. And in 1840, one could hardly imagine, trying to vote for anti-slavery, that this would become the dominant party in the 1860 election. But that, like other significant issues, women's rights, direct election of U.S. senators, progressive income tax, child labor laws, unemployment insurance, all of these have been first promoted by third parties and eventually incorporated into our political culture and into the transformation of that culture. Now, we also have to talk about what have been the obstacles to third parties. And I think some of these are endemic to our electoral system. Some of these are historically conditioned, that is, they're politically contingent based upon the forces at the time. First and foremost is still the problem of ballot access. This remains really difficult in a lot of states. For example, when Henry Wallace ran in 1948, he had to get something like 250,000 votes, 250,000 signatures in California to get on the ballot. Now, that wasn't a lot per se because of the role of one of the leading instruments for Wallace's candidacy, namely the Communist Party, in Los Angeles. But this wasn't just only a total number of votes. He actually had to get a percentage within each county. So to go to these rural counties up north was very difficult to do that. And ballot access remains exceedingly difficult and sometimes partisanly determined. So for example, even though Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate this time, got enough signatures to be on the ballot in Nevada, she was actually kicked off because the presumption, what happened was they said, oh, some of these signatures were printed instead of written. So, you know, again, that's sort of partisan inflection of that. Voter registration. Now, we all know the history of voter registration, and particularly now it's an issue precisely because of the Supreme Court decision invalidating parts of the Voting Rights Act and making it difficult, in particular, for African American students and poor people to vote in those, especially those southern states where the Voting Rights Act had been aimed to try to redress some of those grievances. And you followed along in the news, courts striking down voter ID laws around the country. But that still remains particularly problematic, and especially with ex-felons, for example. In many states, and again, mostly in the South, but not predominantly, in many states, ex-felons cannot vote. It's estimated that in Florida alone, 30% of African American males have been disenfranchised, precisely because of, and the history of how their felonies were acquired has a lot to do with the war on drugs, and which is a bipartisan program. Fusion was one of the issues that emerged in the 19th century where a populist party was able to try to overlap with the Democratic Party and have a different line so that you could still vote Populist Party or Democratic Party, and there might be a fusion of their overall votes. It's only available, it was outlawed for the most part to try to suppress the populist vote and populist insurgency in the late 19th century. It remains on the ballot in some states, like in New York State, where the Working Families Party carries a separate line to the Democratic Party, and often people can show their support for the larger agenda of working families while not endorsing the Democratic Party per se. Stigmatizing and marginalizing. This is, the gatekeepers often do this, now the corporate media, but it used to be the case that, you know, this is the two-party system, the duopoly, that essentially presents this kind of stigmatization and marginalization. And you get all kinds of things where, you know, everything from calling Jill Stein a doctor who supports vaccines, an anti-vaxxer, and you know, all kinds of things like that in order to marginalize her candidacy. Now these are two, these last two are endemic to the electoral system and are the sorts of things that we need to fundamentally change if we're really going to have a representative democracy. We don't. The winner take all, which is an interesting issue because it was addressed by friend of a friend who's here, Leni Guinier, who you may recall was nominated by Bill Clinton to be in the civil rights section of the Justice Department. And her proposal to reconfigure the way the vote would happen to allow for African Americans not to be disenfranchised if they constituted 49% of the vote or 49% of the population, very much talks about that winner take all. We have single districts without proportional representation, so you can get a plurality, let's say, of 30% of the votes and still win the election if there's a multi-candidate election going on. One of the ways to remedy that, and it's on the ballot in Maine, although it's also now has been utilized by cities in the United States like San Francisco and Minneapolis, Burlington, and in countries like Ireland and Australia, is what's called ranked choice voting. So you get to identify 1, 2, 3 and knock out the person who doesn't have the number of votes so that you achieve majority vote by taking the second votes. And that's on the ballot in Maine. It very well will probably pass, and it should then become, as I hope it will, a template for other states and eventually for federal legislation. And finally, this arcane, bizarre, anti-democratic, because the framers were not Democrats with a small d, Electoral College. And this, of course, plays a significant factor in the election of 2000. which was decided fundamentally by a judicial coup. Okay. Another confusion, I think, that I want to try to identify a little bit better is this whole issue of what it means, what are the multiple meanings of the vote. This is like a polyvalent notion of voting, right? The vote is an instrument, and it's an instrument for doing several kinds of things. There are people who are voting out of protest, and some people who voted for Barack Obama or voted for Bernie Sanders are actually a small minority, I think, are voting for Donald Trump because they hate the system, they want to blow up the political establishment, and it's purely a protest vote. Strategy and tactics, the idea is for the Green Party, if it gets 5% of the national vote, it gets additional federal funds for the next election, so there's a strategic element of that. And I have friends who do not particularly like Hillary Clinton, but they see Donald Trump as the fascist at the doorstep and therefore are going to vote against Trump by voting for Hillary Clinton. And finally, again, these are sort of overlapping sometimes, but they have significant sections outside the overlapping Venn diagram here. On values and perspectives. You know, people have values that relate specifically to their sense of political identity. And if you've been on Facebook, you know how much shaming and berating and goes on when people start talking about this election and trying to convince others that throw away your values and vote for this person. All right, so let's get to our first candidate and our first little biographical sketch. Eugene Debs, born in 1855 in Terre Haute, Indiana, early on had become a member of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, and by 1880 he was the editor of their national journal, and in 1885 he was the secretary-treasurer of the Union. At this time, Debs was not a socialist. And although the socialist movement was an international movement at the time, and did have small representations in the United States, and particularly the emergence of the Socialist Labor Party with the head of that party, Daniel De Leon, it still was rather small. What happened is Debs leaves the Brotherhood in 1893 because it's fundamentally a craft union, and he starts the American Railway Union, which is an industrial union. The very next year, that union and the 250,000 members of that union go out on strike, a very famous strike in the history of labor strikes in the United States, 1894, the Pullman strike. And Debs, because strikes at that time are not only legislatively and judicially repressed, but also there is either extra-legal or legal repression of those strikes. So militias, variety of different political organizations, or military, paramilitary organizations, Pinkertons, for example, putting down these kinds of strikes. And Debs was indicted for leading this strike, and he spent 6 months in jail, at which time he started reading the socialist literature and actually came out of prison converted to socialism. In 1900, he runs for what was one of the formations of socialism at the time, the Social Democratic Party, only gaining about 100,000 votes. In 1901, the Socialist Party emerges as a national organization, and it's made up of a variety of strands. There are ethnic connections to the Socialist Party that come out of the Eastern European Jewish experience that are transformed to this country, that come out of the Finnish experience, so you see a lot of Finns up north in Michigan and Minnesota who are part of that Socialist Party. It also has elements of in the labor movement. And even within the American Federation of Labor, the dominant labor organization at the time in the early 20th century, that had about 2 million members, the Socialist Party is constantly agitating within the AFL. And they constitute, that party has, in a sense, right wing, left wings, and center. And the right wing is pretty much aligned with, in international terms, with a man by the name of Edward Bernstein. And Bernstein's theory that eventually, socialism is just going to win automatically. All you have to do is use the ballot, and that's going to happen. Whereas for others, and I don't know if you can read this, and this sort of reflects the center and right appeal. Sorry, Mr. Worker, haven't you been in the grip of this monster long enough? Why not try the knife on him? The knife being the socialist ballot. So running for office will strike down, hopefully building up these militias, these injunctions. And remember, at the time, this class war that was going on, and there's no other way of talking about it, was extremely vicious both at the point of production, where tens of thousands of people were maimed and injured and killed every year by the industrial system and its primitive accumulation of capital, but also there were all, as I mentioned before, efforts to blacklist people, repress through extra-legal and legal means. There also was a left wing, and I think it was represented particularly by the founding of the Industrial Workers of the World in 1905. And Debs initially was part of that, and William Big Bill Haywood, who was on the Socialist Party executive committee until 1912, when he was thrown off because of the embrace of sabotage. And the IWW meant sabotage not as throwing your, like the traditional notion of where that came from, sabot, of throwing your shoe into the machine and destroying it, but the withdrawal of labor from the from the industrial system. And essentially for the IWW, who were direct actionists, they didn't put a lot of they weren't as concerned with the ballot box. In fact, they often called the Socialist Party the Socialists because of their particular movement. But socialism was an enormous political entity. In 1911, there were over 1,000 elected officials in 324 municipal governments in 36 states, including the mayors of Flint, the mayors of Kalamazoo, the mayors of Berkeley, California, and the long-standing, and this would be the longest-standing mayor of any city in the United States who was aligned with the Socialist Party, Milwaukee. And Milwaukee had an old tradition of German socialists going back to the mid-19th century. And Milwaukee, in fact, elected one of the two Socialist Party congresspeople, Victor Berger. The other one, Meyer London, was elected from the Lower East Side out of that ethnic Jewish socialist milieu. So, here they are, Debs and the Socialist Party. Working men, vote your ticket. Unite at the ballot box. Now, it's interesting to see where was it that Eugene Debs won the highest percentage of votes. Anybody want to take a guess which state gave him the highest percentage?
Nevada.
Oh, good. Absolutely, Ron. Here's the ballot. Now, I should mention something else about 1912, which is particularly important. The Republican Party split between the conservative wing, Robert Taft, represented, by William Taft. Robert Taft would be later on. And Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt represented the first iteration of the Progressive Party. Pretty much of a middle-class, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant party that was interested in reforms, particularly because of trying to tame the excesses of capital. And here's the map for Eugene Debs' overall vote, which was 6% of the total vote nationally. But these two, well, Nevada, because of the mining and the strong tradition of the IWW, what the hell with Oklahoma? Oklahoma, which is now one of the most conservative states, apparently, right? Well, there was such a thing as, believe it or not, evangelical socialism. In fact, there were a lot of texts that were written around the turn of the century was, what would happen if Jesus comes back? And Jesus would, condemn the capitalist system. Actually, Pope Francis has done a good job of representing that kind of almost evangelical socialist spirit again in terms of some of his recent encyclicals. So there you get, these were people who held chautauquas. These were people who really fervently believed in the possibility of a new order and socialism being a representation of that. World War I and the repression that ensued destroyed that Socialist Party. Also, what came in the aftermath of, during World War I was a split over the Bolshevik Revolution. And here's the map for that election. As I said, Debs got 900,000 votes, 6% of the votes. Debs went on to run again several times. In 1920 was the last time he ran, but in 1920 he was in prison. And he was in prison because of the sedition law passed in 1917 when the United States entered the war. And anybody who spoke out against that entrance and spoke out against the U.S. participation in the war was liable to 10 years in prison. And Debs got that amount for just speaking out against the war. He got 900,000 votes, but it was fewer percentage, about half of the percentage that he got in 1912. Now, one of the things that's really interesting, and one of the ongoing threads that I think has propelled not only Occupy of several years ago, but also the Bernie Sanders campaign, which was a political representation in some ways of the Occupy movement, is the wide inequality, which was particularly prominent at the time. But if anybody's been familiar with the work of Thomas Piketty, and particularly his discussion of inequality, the inequality now is actually greater than it was in 1910, at the time that Debs was running. All right, so let's move on to our next campaign and a little biographical sketch, and that's Henry Wallace. Okay, Wallace was born in 1888 in Iowa. He graduates in 1910 from Iowa State. His dad actually was a Republican and had served as the agricultural secretary under Harding and Coolidge. But Henry started heading off in a different direction. And really interesting to Wallace's trajectory is the fact that George Washington Carver, the famous African-American agronomist, was teaching at Iowa State, where Wallace went, but could not get any housing because of the segregation and white supremacy at the time. So they gave him a room in their house, in the Wallace household. And it influenced Wallace. In 1926, he established a hybrid corn company that grew enormously, and it gained him all kinds of wealth. And in 1933, he's appointed by FDR as the Secretary of Agriculture. He would run twice. He would be part of that ticket in 1932 and in 1936. He'd be Secretary of Agriculture both times. And of course, in 1936, I'm reading this fascinating book, the new book by Ira Katznelson on the New Deal. And I think we haven't fully comprehended how contradictory the New Deal was in terms of its white supremacist support among Southerners. And in 1936, just as a side note, this was mind-blowing. What percentage of the vote did FDR get in South Carolina? 99%. Unbelievable. 99%. Of course, as Wallace would see in Mississippi, which gave FDR in 1936 96%. When Wallace ran in 1948, and he ran running on the anti-racist platform going into the southern states with Paul Robeson, and I'll talk more about Robeson, and talking to integrated audiences, there were only 1% of African Americans were registered in Mississippi. Only 1%. Now that wouldn't change a lot, right, until the 60s with the efforts by Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, by CORE, by the NAACP and other civil rights organizations. What happens in, he doesn't get the nomination in 1940. Why not? Because it's the beginning of the reaction and the beginning of that split with the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats become a much more conservative element because no longer is white supremacy sort of built into the New Deal politics, but because of the rise of the CIO, things get pulled to the left, and the challenge to racial equality, even though there's all kinds of problems within the industrial sector and the CIO organizing within that industrial sector, nonetheless, the Southern Democrats and the big city bosses come together to throw Wallace off the ticket in 1940, even though he's very popular with a lot of people, and they nominate somebody from one of the boss-led city machines, Harry S. Truman, as the vice president.
44.
Oh, 44. I'm sorry. You're right. He's the Secretary of Commerce under FDR, and then under Truman, and eventually thrown off of Secretary of Commerce. Yeah, he was so it's 1940 is when he runs after 2 terms as, to clarify, Secretary of Agriculture, 32, 36, and 40 he's given the vice presidency. In 44 he loses out to Truman. After he's fired by Truman in 1946 from the Secretary of Commerce, he becomes the editor of the New Republic, and then runs in 1948 for the Progressive Party. And he runs on the left-wing agenda of the New Deal. And this agenda is fundamentally around the articulation of what was FDR's famous statement in 1944 on the Economic Bill of Rights. Everybody is entitled to a job, everybody is entitled to health care. This left wing of that agenda is basically Bernie Sanders' campaign. Fundamentally, Bernie Sanders was a New Deal Democrat, and a left-wing social democrat, not so much even though he identified as a socialist, but I'd argue a left-wing social democrat. This is the unfulfilled New Deal, but it's represented by Henry Wallace, and here he is: vote for Wallace, support his program for peace, democracy, and prosperity. Women for Wallace. Interesting, Mrs. Eleanor Gimbel. I wonder if she's related to the famous Gimbels. May very well have been. And Wallace, the other thing that got Wallace particularly marginalized was the fact that Wallace was insistent that the coalition that had been developed in World War II, that included the Soviet Union, should remain in place in the aftermath of World War II. And as Stalin consolidated his support or his cordon sanitaire in Eastern Europe, a lot of those Eastern European constituents who had been part of the New Deal coalition were repelled by the Wallace candidacy and sort of left the New Deal and would become increasingly conservative over time. All right, so here's Wallace campaigning with Paul Robeson. And how many people know who Paul Robeson was? I'm sure. Okay. So Robeson was this incredible scholar, had gone to Rutgers undergrad, a football player, gone to Columbia Law School, an actor, a singer, an activist. Brilliant. And Robeson identified with the left. And Robeson not only came to Detroit with Henry Wallace in 1948, filled the music hall, but went south with him also. And this was kind of astounding in terms of what happened with the Progressive Party. Well, before we get to that, let me go back. So the Progressive Party has a number of different iterations, right? The first one being in 1912, when it was essentially Theodore Roosevelt's progressive Bull Moose Party, pretty much white middle class. In 1924, however, through the earlier intervention of Robert La Follette from Wisconsin, the Progressive Party had become more and more a working class party, and identified as such. And La Follette was able to get, for the first and only time, the AFL to endorse a third party. And La Follette, for that, in 1924, actually got about 16% of the vote. Fairly successful when you measure it against the other campaigns. Now, what's going on at the time is that Truman, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and the upsurge in strikes, there was a massive strike wave in steel, on the railroads, all of which Truman responded by repression. And this created a real split initially between Truman and the CIO. In fact, so much so that the majority of the CIO at the time favored a Labor Party by a 33-11 vote at the National Executive. And in April 1946, even the UAW board said, we want to work towards the eventual formation of a broad third party based upon the thinking interests of millions of labor, farmers, professionals, and other progressives. That begins to change almost overnight with the emergence of the Cold War and with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 and its anti-communist clause. And it's used then by the UAW and other unions to throw out the communists as much as possible within the UAW, particularly at a place like Local 600, where the CP did dominate. So here's what happens then. Truman, after the promotion of loyalty oaths that the Truman administration promoted and also were promoted by the Taft-Hartley, Truman begins to make some overtures again to labor and the left. He vetoes Taft-Hartley, and at the Democratic Convention in 1948, the party led by Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota embraces a civil rights plank. It leads to the immediate withdrawal of a lot of the Southern Democrats, led by Strom Thurmond, who at the time was a Democrat before he changed his suit, and went to the Republican Party. And in fact, the States' Rights Party wins several Deep South states in 1948. Wallace wins no Southern states, only taking about 2.5% of the national vote. And the Progressive Party in 1952 runs again, but pretty much withers and dies under the influence of the Communist Party. Was the major promoter of the 1948 Wallace campaign. Here in Michigan, it's interesting, Ernie Goodman, one of the lawyers, famous lawyers of Michigan, ran for Attorney General. We have another former Attorney General candidate with us today, but ran as Coleman Young ran on the Progressive Party in 1948, and Coleman said it was one of the great mistakes he made. And there were others who ran in Michigan. All right, let's get to finally the last one and the most contentious one, and this is the one who you will hear most about, right? Who you get beaten over the head. You don't want Ralph Nader again. You don't want to vote for a third party. Look what Nader did in 2000. Well, it's a hell of a lot more complicated than blaming Ralph Nader's Florida vote. And in fact, as I will argue, although there are lots of reasons for what happened in that 2000 election, the fundamental issue was a judicial coup by a 5-4 partisan vote that stopped the vote in Florida. But we'll talk more about that. Nader's born to Lebanese immigrant parents in 1934 in Connecticut. He manages to get a number of scholarships, first to Princeton University and then to Harvard Law, where he is editor of the Harvard Law Review, like our president. At Harvard Law School, it's the first time he writes an article for one of the issues of the Harvard Law Review on automobile safety. And this will become the vehicle, literally, excuse the pun, to which Ralph gains more and more notoriety, and is able, because of the publication in 1965 of Unsafe at Any Speed, his testament to unsafe automobiles and collusion of people in General Motors to make these kinds of automobiles, for which General Motors went after him in a dirty tricks campaign, eventually having to apologize publicly and pay him some money for what they did. From the money that he gets from Unsafe at Any Speed, Nader begins to gather a whole group of young attorneys, other activists, to form what are known as Nader's Raiders, and fundamentally to take on what they consider to be the corporate excesses of the day, primarily looking at ways to protect consumers from these corporate excesses. And again, I think you can see that resonance of that in Bernie Sanders' campaign. And you can even see some of it in, believe it or not, Trump's railing against NAFTA, etc. Ralph starts running for president in 1992, 1996 as an independent, but in 2000 he runs for presidency as a Green Party. I was very active in that campaign in 2000 here in Michigan. Let me talk a little bit about the Green Party. And I want to highlight in particular who I think is the patron saint for me of the Green Party, and that's Petra Kelly. Because the Green Party is an international party, also emerging at the time in Western Europe and the United States, primarily an anti-nuke party, an environmental party. Die Grünen in Germany. Atomic power? No, thank you. Petra Kelly was born to a German mother and an American GI father. She becomes one of the leading spokespeople for the Greens in Germany. She's a member of parliament where because of proportional representation in parliament in multi-party districts, she's able to represent the Greens from essentially 1983 to 1990. And here's Petra Kelly writing in the 80s. The Greens seek a new lifestyle for the Western world as well as their personal lives. They would like to see an alternative way of life without exploitation, and they are for nonviolent relationships with others and with themselves, and relationships free from fear and based upon mutual support. And this pretty much informs a lot of the notions of the four pillars of the Green Party of nonviolence, grassroots democracy, ecological wisdom, and social justice. And the Greens eventually, and they have tendencies, right and left tendencies, the Greens eventually become part of the majority coalition running Germany, and creating some bad friction within the Greens because of their alignment on certain kinds of foreign policy questions with the Socialist Party. Now, what is it that goes on in the late 90s that particularly provides that kind of impetus for the Green Party and Nader's campaign? Well, I think it's that whole anti-corporate globalization struggle. And it's represented in its most ferocious expression in 1999 in Seattle, in what's called the Battle of Seattle, which is the World Trade Organization is a transnational organization representing the interests of corporate capital, to which lots of people are fighting, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, including the Zapatistas in the jungles of Mexico in 1994 when they make their first appearance right after the promotion of NAFTA. Now, Nader Winona LaDuke, indigenous activist who's still very active in the Standing Rock campaign that's going on now. And one of the things is for Nader, for many people, remember the Clinton administration was essentially viewed by a lot of people as a moderate Republican. administration that essentially carried out the sort of things that Democrats would have never carried out previously, namely promotion of ending welfare, expanding the drug war, expanding mass incarceration, and all you have to do is read Michelle Alexander on the devastation that that caused to, in particular, people of color in the African American community. People were not at all enamored of Clinton or Gore, and especially in 2000, Gore and Bush agreed on increasing the military budget, not different from the two candidates running now, expanding the use of the death penalty, both I think expanding the war on drugs, deregulation of sections of the economy. Now there was a dime's worth of difference between Gore and Bush, but a lot of overlap between, and therefore the reason to see the possibility of a third party. Now a lot comes down to what happens in Florida. And I think you need to have some background on what occurred in Florida, first of all. The partisan Secretary of State in Florida, Catherine Harris, leads a purge of the roll of voters in before the 2000 election, especially throwing tens of thousands of African Americans off the roll. The NAACP, among a few others, protests, but not a lot is remembered or even heard about that. In Florida in particular, there are these bizarre countywide ballots. And this one is known as the butterfly ballot that confused the hell out of the older people living down there in Palm Beach County, where the national bird, as you know, is the early bird special. So here, people looked at the ballot and they go, oh, Republican and the Democrat, I'm going to just vote for the Democrat, and I just pulled this one, number 2, and wind up voting for Pat Buchanan. Jews for Buchanan. A very interesting group of people who actually never really existed, but given the butterfly ballot, there was also all kinds of confusion. There were undervotes and overvotes, hanging chads, and all of that sort of stuff. And the process of trying to recount those votes was interrupted, if you remember from Michael Moore's film, Fahrenheit 9/11, that the Republican Party actually sent goon squads into a number of counties where the votes were going on to disrupt the vote. And that, so that happened, that kind of disruption. And eventually, of course, this goes to the U.S. Supreme Court about whether the votes should continue. The Gore people made a mistake by asking for just 2 or 3 counties instead of the whole of Florida to be recounted. And in addition, 30% of Democrats in Florida actually voted for Bush. So when you get down to it, given who turned out and what the votes were and all the confusion that went on and the intervention by the Republican goon squads and essentially then by the Republican-dominated U.S. Supreme Court, where 2 of the justices, Scalia and Thomas, had relatives working on the Bush campaign. They should have recused themselves. They should not have been, and that decision was a bizarre, once-in-a-lifetime position, using the 14th Amendment and the equal protection clause was bizarrely applied. And so here's what happens. Nader gets, in Florida, almost 100,000 votes. He gets about 2.9% nationally. But those votes, because the margin at the time of the interruption was 537 by Bush. Now recall, Al Gore won the national vote by 500,000 votes. Over 500,000 votes went to Gore. And as you can see, right? And of course what happens is that the Supreme Court stops the vote from going forward on December 12th. Had it gone forward, most news agencies agree that actually Gore would have won with a fair recount. And a lot of us were out in the streets protesting, primarily led by African American organizations. And when it came to verify the elections, which Congress does on January 6th of every year, as they will again this year. Only you can challenge the votes from electoral votes from a particular state. Most of those Congressional Black Caucus, a lot of members of the Congressional Black Caucus got up and challenged the final electoral vote from Florida. But you need to have one senator so that an investigation can go forward. Hillary Clinton was one of the senators at the time. Actually, even Russ Feingold was. They couldn't get one single senator to sign on. And I guess today the New York Times had one of those, their good liberal editorials like, oh, you have to accept the decision, be gracious like Al Gore was. Gracious. I mean, this was a judicial coup. There should have been millions and millions of people out in the streets. Some of us did go to DC and protested, but I mean, and of course it's easier now to blame Ralph Nader for what happened than to look at our arcane, bizarre, partisan, and endemic institutions as the reason for this vote. Subliminal message? Okay. And here's my final take on all of this. And it is from one of my favorite historians, Howard Zinn. The election frenzy that seizes the country every 4 years because we've been brought up to believe that voting is crucial in determining our destiny, that the most important act a citizen can engage in is to go to the polls and choose one of the two mediocrities who have already been chosen for us. Would I support one candidate against another? Yes, for 2 minutes. The amount of time it takes to pull the lever down in the voting booth. But before and after those 2 minutes, our time, our energy should be spent in educating, agitating, organizing our fellow citizens in the workplace, the neighborhood, and the schools. Our objective should be to build painstakingly, patiently, but energetically a movement that when it reaches a certain critical mass would shake whoever is in the White House, in Congress, into changing national policy on matters of war and social justice. And we better get to work November 9th, whatever the outcome is. Thank you. Questions, comments, criticisms?
Questions, comments?
I know, everybody's just so tired. Do we have to?
So why did the, in your summary, how would you summarize? How did the left collapse after, let's say, 48?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several strands of what happens.
Or another way to put it is, why did the Cold War succeed?
Many, many books have been written about that, but let me try to highlight a couple of things. There is, I think, one of the most important fractures that goes on is within the labor movement itself. As you can see from what I was quoting from, the CIO was very much in favor in the immediate aftermath of World War II of some kind of labor party, or left expression for electoral purposes. But I think several things had happened. The CP, the Communist Party, played what was a significant role in helping to organize the CIO in the 1930s with people like John Lewis. But during the war, because of the allegiance to the Soviet Union, the Communist Party often tried to put down what were wildcat strikes in the plains. They lost some traction because of that with militants in the union movement. And there were also obviously splits because of the whole issue of Stalinism. Recall that as I mentioned before, those ethnic elements that were part of the New Deal coalition, a lot of whom were from Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, and were part of the core of the CIO. When Stalin consolidated power within Eastern Europe, it created even more alienation from the Communist Party and from the left. played upon then by these right-wing forces, particularly within the Catholic Church. And those of you who are old enough like me to remember Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, who used to have a television program in the 1950s, right, promoting this right-wing version of Catholicism that was particularly attractive. And its roots, of course, go back to Father Coughlin in the 1930s and the Shrine of the Little the Shrine of the Little Flower. So it's, you know, there's that element. There's also the element of the role that the Soviet Union played, or the Communist Party played, in promoting Soviet interest in the post-World War II period, so that on issues like the U.S., like the Marshall Plan, to which there's lots of criticisms that come from, you know, from the left in Europe in particular, but there were a lot of splits. So, for example, I knew people in the Democratic Farmer and Labor Party in Minnesota. That was the Democratic Party essentially in Minnesota. And whenever they'd have meetings in 1948, if they could identify somebody as an opponent of the Marshall Plan, they would literally throw that person out of the meeting. So there were the splits. In addition, there were all kinds of raids that went on in the aftermath of Taft-Hartley on those militant and left-leaning unions, like United Electrical Workers. In Minneapolis, UE was the big union at Honeywell, which was a major corporate company in Minneapolis. It was raided by the Teamsters in 1948, and the UE was thrown out. And so what you had is the paring away, the alienation, the slippage, the erosion of that militant support for the left-wing agenda of the CIO, and the compromising of it also by the Communist Party. And I think you know, the Cold War then gets sold constantly as a way of preventing the takeover of the United States by sinister forces. And all of us remember from the 50s those kinds of campaigns that went on, and the duck and cover sorts of things, and, about the nuke. But that's only a partial discussion of that. I hope it gets at some of the issues.
I just talk about it.
Okay. Ollie.
Yes, Fred, thank you so much for your presentation. I have several questions, but I want to begin with, is the Electoral College, as it's structured here in the United States, in existence in any other country in the world?
No.
Is
No.
it unique to the United States?
Its emergence wasn't necessarily, I mean, I'm trying to think about you know, when it's part of what the framers embed, and it of course has some bizarre results in the first elections in our national history, because what happens is the president of one party and the vice president of another party get the most electoral votes. And so you have these two different parties together. And so then in the early 1800s, there's an amendment, the 12th Amendment, that actually reconfigures it so that the Electoral College, the president and the vice president will come from the same party. But the electors are seen as brakes upon the national popular vote, which, remember again, was up until the Jacksonian democratic transformation, was pretty much meant you had to be a property owner in most of these states. And then it was just, you know, free, white, and 21 under the Jacksonian thing. And it took forever, of course, for African Americans and women to finally get the enfranchised. So, yeah, the Electoral College is still unique to the United States and arcane, and is fundamentally anti-democratic when you consider that it should be the straight popular vote, which is the case in every country that I know, where for the president.
And I ask because I think I agree the Electoral College is an anti-democratic institution, and was thought of that way to kind of press potential popular sentiment. But would you consider the overall political system as authoritarian, or how would you
Funny that you should ask.
articulate?
I wrote this piece that was published on Counterpunch about a couple of weeks ago about the rigged system. I don't call it a rigged electoral system. It's a rigged political system. When you consider, all of the factors that go into marginalizing people of color, the class-based nature of the political system itself. So, yeah, I mean, I think we have, and I'm in favor of a constitutional convention again to reconsider how we make ourselves into a truly representative democracy. And one of the things is, get rid of the Senate, for example. How can you have 600,000 people from Wyoming with 2 senators and 40 million people from California with 2 senators? Well, you can have it if it was seen initially as, again, an anti-democratic control mechanism. It wasn't changed until the early 20th century when there was direct election of senators. So there's a lot that needs to be done, it seems to me, to transform the system. But we hold on to what is essentially a slave document, the Constitution, with the exception of certain elements of most of the first 10 amendments. The Second Amendment was a slave amendment too, because a militia was essentially constructed to slave patrollers and to repress indigenous people. So, yeah, I think we need to revisit the whole thing of how we have a constitution, but there's a lot of inertia. There's just a lot of lack of imagination when it comes to that. There have been people, political scientists like Joel Rogers and others from Wisconsin, who talked about what you need to do to transform this. There have been people at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York who have also talked about the need for electoral reforms. So and particularly in the aftermath of 2000. And actually there was, even in the end of the 1960s, there was an effort to end the Electoral College because of how close the 1968 election was. And it passed the House. It was stalled in the Senate, so it never really got anywhere. So yeah, there's a much larger matter we need to address, I think, if we're going to have a really truly representative democracy.
So now, the House of Lords and the Senate are the more liberal chambers.
Well, it depends on what kinds of issues you're talking about. And it's true that in the way that the Republicans have gerrymandered the election, that certainly it's the case that what you have, and I mentioned this, that you've got an overrepresentation of rural, people from rural states, rural areas, whiter populations, and an underrepresentation in the House of people from cities and people of color. So again, that's another one of the flaws of the system. Other questions, comments? Well, I wish everybody go out, commune with nature tomorrow. Realize that we've got to save our planet, and irrespective of who's in there, there'll be more work for us ahead. So, thank you.
So don't accept the result.